All right, let's get right into the incredible spiritual journey of one of history's most important thinkers, Al-Ghazali. This is a story about a man's search for absolute truth, a quest that led him right to the edge of an abyss, a crisis that would shake his entire world to its core. From a very young age, he looked at the world with all its competing beliefs and philosophies, and he didn't just see ideas, he saw a vast, treacherous ocean. And he felt this unstoppable pull, not just to wade in, but to dive deep into those depths and find out for himself what was real. So that's the real question here. This is the story of Al-Ghazali's hunt for certainty. And it's a journey that didn't start with a neat answer, but with an absolutely devastating crisis of doubt, one that nearly swallowed him whole. Okay, so you have to picture this. Al-Ghazali is at the very top of his game. He's a celebrated scholar, and his standard for knowledge is just absolute certainty. We're talking about the kind of knowledge where there is zero room for error or doubt. But then he turns that razor-sharp critical eye on himself, and everything starts to fall apart. First, he puts his own senses on trial. He thinks about how a shadow looks perfectly still, but, over time, you see it's moved. Or how a star in the sky looks like a tiny little coin, but he knows through geometry that it's actually way bigger than the entire Earth. So, okay, his senses are totally unreliable. But then, an even more terrifying thought hits him. We use our reason to correct what our senses get wrong. But what if there's some higher power, some other reality out there that one day will show our reason to be just as flawed as a dream we have when we're asleep? And you have to understand, this wasn't just some fun intellectual puzzle for him. It became a real sickness. For 2 months, he was just lost, trapped in this state of complete skepticism, where he couldn't even build a logical argument, because he didn't trust the basic building blocks of logic itself. He was completely intellectually paralyzed. So how did he get out of it? Well, it wasn't some brilliant new proof or a clever argument that saved him. He says his recovery came from an act of grace, what he describes as a divine light that God cast into him, which restored his faith in his mind's ability to know things. The crisis was over, but his real journey was just getting started. So now that he's back on his feet, Al-Ghazali decides he's going to do a systematic investigation. He desperately wants to find the true source of certain knowledge, so he sets out to explore every major intellectual and spiritual path of his time. He basically identifies 4 main groups of people who are searching for truth. You've got the theologians, the philosophers, those who follow an infallible teacher, and finally, the mystics. And he makes a promise to himself. He's going to walk down each of these roads to the very, very end and see where it actually goes. He decides to start with the intellectual heavyweights, right? The theologians and the philosophers. And he examines their methods with that same relentless demand for absolute certainty. When he looks at the scholastic theologians, he concludes that they're fantastic at defending the faith from heresy. Their arguments are like a strong fortress wall, great for defense. But here's the problem. A fortress can't cure the sickness of doubt inside you. It couldn't give him the positive, foundational truth that he was so desperate to find. So then he turns to philosophy, and he spends 2 whole years mastering it, not because he wants to become a philosopher, but so he can critique it from the inside out. And his analysis is just surgical. He sees things like math and logic as really valuable tools, but he also sees a danger. Their precision can trick students into just blindly accepting the philosopher's much shakier claims in other areas, especially metaphysics, which he says is where all the biggest mistakes are made. So after digging through all of their arguments, he comes up with a list of 20 major errors in their thinking. But he says 3 of them, just 3, were so serious that they placed these philosophers completely outside the faith of Islam. And here are the big 3. First, the idea that only our souls get resurrected, not our physical bodies. Second, the claim that God's knowledge is kind of general, that he knows about universal concepts, but not the specific individual details of our lives. And third, the idea that the universe has just always existed, that it wasn't created at a specific point in time. For Al-Ghazali, these weren't just philosophical debates, they were flat-out contradictions of revealed truth. So, having found the paths of theology and philosophy to be dead ends for his particular quest, he turns all his attention to that final road, the direct experiential way of the Sufi mystics. And this is where he stumbles upon a concept that changes absolutely everything for him. It's the idea of Dhawq. It's all about the difference between knowing about something and experiencing it for yourself. Think of it like this. It's the difference between reading a restaurant menu and actually tasting the food. This just illustrates the point so perfectly. A doctor can know every single textbook definition of health and still be sick. A sober person can explain the science of being drunk. But only the healthy person actually experiences health, and only the drunk person experiences what it's like to be drunk. And that's when it clicked for Al-Ghazali. Real, certain knowledge had to be tasted, not just defined in his head. But this realization brings on a second, even deeper crisis. He takes a hard look at his life, his prestigious career, his hundreds of adoring students, and he sees that it was all built on a foundation of ego. He was doing it for fame and glory, not for God. This internal war was so intense that it actually became physical. The great speaker, Al-Ghazali, literally lost the ability to speak. Feeling like a total spiritual fraud, he does something unthinkable. He walks away from it all. His fame, his money, his position as the most famous scholar in Baghdad, gone. He then begins a 10-year journey of solitude, retreat, and intense spiritual practice, all to purify his own heart. So after a full decade in the spiritual wilderness, he returns to the world. But he is not the same man who left. Not even close. He came back with a completely new mission in life. You can see the total transformation here. Before his journey, he taught from his mind, chasing worldly honor. After his return, he taught from his heart, a heart that had been cleansed by direct experience. His new goal wasn't about winning arguments anymore. It was about guiding himself and others toward becoming better human beings. And through this whole ordeal, he finally understood the true role of the prophets. They weren't just super philosophers with better arguments. They were spiritual doctors, physicians of the heart, who could diagnose our spiritual sicknesses and prescribe the divine remedies, like prayer and worship, that lead to real healing. And this, right here, is probably the biggest takeaway from his entire life. Reason is crucial, but it has its place. He realized the intellect is like a guide that can lead a blind person to the doctor's office. It's good enough to help you recognize who the true physician is. But to actually get well, you have to trust the doctor's sight and take the medicine they give you. So, what can we take away from Al-Ghazali's incredible story? Well, for one, that absolute certainty can't be found just in books or arguments. It shines a huge spotlight on that massive difference between knowing and tasting. It shows us that a crisis of doubt doesn't have to be the end. It can be the very beginning of a deeper search. And that in the end, true knowledge doesn't just change what you think, it changes who you are. And all of this leaves us with a really powerful question for our own time, doesn't it? We live in an age where we're drowning in data and information. We can know about anything in a matter of seconds. But what does it truly mean to understand something? Is the real path to truth found in just gathering more information, or is it found in the courageous and sometimes scary act of direct experience?